Welcome everyone to the first talk of the webinar series Speaking of Variation in Language, organized by Lancaster University's Department of Linguistics and English Language. My name is Daniel Van Olmen, and what I'm going to talk about in this session is variation in the domain of grammar between English and the languages of the world. More specifically, we are going to look at some grammatical phenomena in English and see whether English is different from or similar to most of the world's languages. A battle of the grammars, if you want. Now, if you have any questions during my talk about the topic or about, for instance, studying linguistics or English language at university, please use the Q&A or question and answer chat function, and I will come back to your questions at the end. Okay, let's start with a quote from the German writer Johan Wolfgang von Goethe. Those who know nothing of foreign languages know nothing of their own. Now, this claim is probably a bit too strong, but on the other hand, it's probably still true that when learning another language, for instance, people are often quick to dismiss as strange or weird features of that language that they don't have in their own language. However, those same people might not be aware of the fact that their own language is in fact quite strange in certain ways as well when compared to the rest of the world's languages. And our first example of English versus the world's languages has to do with the two little words the and a. This sentence here, Daniel is reading book, is clearly not an okay sentence in English. The reason for this is that the English language requires its speakers to use either the definite article the or the indefinite article a. So it needs to be either Daniel is reading the book or Daniel is reading a book. And what determines the choice between the and a is whether or not we know the book that is being referred to. If we know it, we say Daniel is reading the book. If we don't know it, we say Daniel is reading a book. Question for us here is whether other languages have things like the and a. And this guy here, Matthew Dreyer, answered that question for us. He looked at numerous languages from all over the world, and he found that only 1/3 of languages have anything resembling the and a. What is more, only 1/4 of those languages, so 1/4 of that 1/3, only 1/4 have both something close to definite the as well as something close to indefinite a. In other words, English belongs to a minority of about 8% of languages in having both the definite article the and the indefinite article a. Now, these findings raise two questions. Most languages don't have any articles. So the first question is, do we need articles in the first place? Now, languages with articles don't usually have definite and indefinite articles. So the second question is, do we really need both? Let's look at the first question first. Do we need articles? Remember that articles express whether what is being referred to is known to us or not known to us. Well, it appears that very often we don't actually need articles for that. It is usually clear from the context whether something is definite or indefinite. Take the following little story, for instance. Chris gave Helen scratch card. She scratched card and won £10. With banknote, she bought new scratch card. Now, I've deleted all the articles, but I don't think that there is any doubt about any of the words in here, whether they're definite or indefinite. If we start a story with Chris gave Helen scratch card, it's obvious that it's a scratch card because this is the first mention of this card and we therefore don't know it yet. Now, continuing that story with she scratched card and won £10. Well, if we continue the story that way, then we do know which card it is. That is the card that Helen got from Chris. So it's clear from the situation that the intended interpretation here is she scratched the card. And the same kind of reasoning applies to the rest of the story. With the banknote, namely the £10, she bought a new scratch card, a card that we don't know yet. So the reason why most languages don't bother with articles is because it's typically evident from the context anyway whether something is definite or indefinite. And that brings us to the second question. So despite what I said, you can probably imagine that there are contexts where there might still be some ambiguity between a definite and an indefinite interpretation. And that is why some languages do have articles. But, and this is our question, do such languages with articles need a definite article as well as an indefinite article? And the answer seems to be no again. Because if we only have a definite article, for instance, it is its absence that expresses indefiniteness. Vice versa, if we only have an indefinite article, it is its absence that signals definiteness. Imagine, for instance, that English only had the. In that case, the sentence Daniel is reading book would mean Daniel is reading a book because the isn't there. Similarly, if English only had the indefinite article a, the sentence Daniel is reading book would have a definite interpretation. Daniel is reading the book. You could, in other words, say that it is perhaps a bit superfluous to have both a definite article and an indefinite article. So, how does English compare to the world's languages with both the and a? Well, on a scale from weird to normal, I think it is pretty clear that as far as this particular feature is concerned, English is on the weird end of the spectrum compared to the world's languages. Let's see whether English fares any better when it comes to he and she. In sentences like he is reading the book and she is reading the book. These two words are what grammarians call personal pronouns, and the difference between he and she essentially makes it possible for English to indicate whether a single third person, an individual third party, so not the speaker or the hearer, whether that third person identifies as male in gender with masculine he, or whether that person identifies as female in gender with feminine she. Now, how do personal pronouns deal with gender in other languages? Take, for instance, Mandarin Chinese. This language uses the personal pronoun ta to refer to a single third person, but it does this irrespective of whether that person identifies as male or female. In other words, ta can mean either he or she. Put differently, unlike English, Chinese does not appear to make a gender distinction in its personal pronouns, at least not in spoken language. In writing, in actual fact, Chinese uses different characters for he and she, but both characters are pronounced in exactly the same way, namely as ta. What about a South African language like Korana, sorry. Well, this language has not only separate forms for he and she, like English, it also has two forms for the personal pronoun I, which of course stands for the speaker, and also two forms for the personal pronoun you, that refers to the hearer. And the difference between the two forms is gender-based. So if I were to say in Korana, I love steak, I would have to use the pronoun sats because I identify as male. But if, say, my mom were to say I love steak in this language, she would have to use the personal pronoun sas because she obviously identifies as female in gender. And it's essentially the same story for masculine you T-ray, and feminine U, theta. In short, Korana makes a gender distinction not only for third persons, but also for the personal pronoun I, that is the speaker. In grammar, we call that the first person. And it also makes a gender distinction for the personal pronoun you, that is the hearer, which we call the second person in grammar. Our next question is, of course, whether most languages are like English, like Chinese, or like Korana. And to answer that question, we can use this amazing free online resource called the World Atlas of Language Structures, or WALS. So let me show you how we can use it to answer our question. This link here, wals.info, will take you to the website, which looks like this. And clicking on chapters here in the menu, that takes us to the page that is relevant for us. So the WALS is essentially a collection of chapters discussing many different phenomena in language, and what each chapter tries to do is describe the variation that we find in the world's languages. It also gives us numbers for the different patterns, so we can see what is frequent and what is infrequent in the world. And it also puts the different patterns on a map, so we can see where the patterns occur. Now, for our purposes, we could scroll down here and try and find a chapter about personal pronouns and gender, but we could also just use the lookup function here, Control F, and type in, say, personal pronouns and see what we get. And here we have some hits, and it is this here, gender distinctions in independent personal pronouns. That's the chapter that we need. And if you click on that link, then you get to this here, the chapter where the entire feature is discussed. And we can now go straight to the map here. So if you click on the map here, then you get this. And if you scroll down, you can see a map of the world with dots in different shapes and colors. Now, what is immediately clear from this map is that there are many, many white circles. In fact, a majority of white circles. And if we look at the legend, so here you have legend, if you look at the legend in the left top corner, then we can see that these are all languages, so the white circle here, they are all languages with no gender distinctions in their personal pronouns. In other words, languages like Chinese. Now, the pink circles, which you can see here, they stand for languages like English, with he versus she. And there are clearly fewer of those than of the languages of the Chinese type, the white circles. And the blue circles are languages like Korana, and you can see that there are even fewer of those. So languages that have masculine and feminine forms for I and you as well are even less frequent than English. Now, if we crunch the numbers from the WALS, we find the following. 67% of languages make no gender distinctions. Put differently, 2/3 of languages are like Chinese. Now, what is also interesting is that most of the remaining languages, 84% of the remaining languages are like English, in that they only make gender distinctions for third persons and not for the speaker, I, or the hearer, you. Now, another way of putting this is, if a language makes gender distinctions in its personal pronouns, it is very likely to do that just for the third person, he and she. And why is that? Well, when does masculine versus feminine actually provide useful extra information? If you're talking to someone, the forms he and she might come in handy to make clear that you're talking to them about your friend John, he, or your friend Mary, she. However, there's probably less of a need to have a form expressing that you as a speaker or the other person as the hearer, whether either of you identify as male or female in gender, simply because you're in the same place at the same time and can probably tell anyway. Now, just to be clear, what I'm not saying here is that there's only one way for men or women to be or exist. People should be free to self-identify, to dress and behave the way they want, regardless of gender and alike. What language is reflecting here is that in the majority of cases, we can and do make correct assumptions about the people we're talking to and about their gender. So, what does all of this mean for English versus the world's languages on our scale from weird to normal? Well, most languages do not distinguish he from she, which means that English is definitely on the weird end of the spectrum. That said, there are still quite a few languages that do make that gender distinction for third persons. So compared to having both the and indefinite English is probably slightly less weird when it comes to having he and she. And that's kind of why I put it a bit more to the right than the and Okay, our third example then. This one is concerned with a phenomenon called basic word order. Now, to make clear what this is, let's explore the following scenario. Imagine that you get these three random words, or rather phrases, namely ate, my teacher, and the cannibal. And imagine you are then asked who is doing the eating here and who is being eaten. The technical term for the doer of the action, the eater here, is agent. And the term for the undergoer of the action, the ET, if you want, is patient. And these terms of agent and patient are important, by the way. Now, so if you're asked to decide who is agent and who is patient based on these three words out of context, well, I think you're probably very likely to say that the cannibal is the agent, the doer of the eating, and that my teacher is the patient, the undergoer of the eating. And that makes perfect sense, of course, because you know what the word cannibal means, and you know that cannibals eat people. But what about this sentence here? My teacher ate the cannibal. Not some random words, but the words in a particular order. How do we know that in this sentence, it is the teacher who is the agent or the doer, and it is the cannibal who is the patient or the undergoer? Well, it is the basic word order of English that tells us that. So in the prototypical sentence, we have a verb and two entities involved in what the verb expresses. In a sentence like the girl kicked the ball, for instance, we have the verb kick and the two entities of the girl and the ball. Just like we have the verb eat and the two entities of the teacher and the cannibal. These three elements come in a particular order in English. The entity before the verb is described as the most agent-like entity, or sometimes also just called the A. The entity after the verb is the most patient-like entity, or P. So in the sentence, my teacher ate the cannibal, we know that it is the teacher doing the eating because teacher precedes the verb. And we know that the cannibal is undergoing the eating because the cannibal follows the verb. If we were to turn things around, we get the cannibal ate my teacher, and in that case, it's the cannibal before the verb that is the agent, and the teacher after the verb that is the patient. And so because of this particular order of things, we call English an AVP language. Agent-like entity A first, then the verb V, and finally the patient-like entity P. Now, not all languages put A, V, and P in that order though. Here you have a prototypical sentence in Japanese, for instance. Now the first line here is Japanese. The second line, one tells the second line tells you what each word means, and the third line is the translation. And the translation is John read the letter. Now, if you look at the second line, it is clear that the order in Japanese is not the same as in English. The order here is John, the letter, read. In other words, John here is the A, the H, and the letter is the P, and then we have the verb, making Japanese not an AVP, but an APV language. Now, in total, logically, there are 4 more ways in which these 3 elements of A, P, and V can be ordered. In addition to APV, like Japanese, and AVP, like English, we have VAP, VPA, PVA, and PAV. That's just the logical combinations. The question is whether all these different orders are equally frequent. So let me throw the world's languages at you again. This map also comes from the World Atlas of Language Structures, and it is clear that there are 2 dominant orders here. We have the red circles and the blue circles, which clearly dominate. So let's have a look at the actual numbers now. The blue circles are all APV languages, like Japanese, while the red circles are all AVP languages, like English. The yellow circles then are languages in which you say read John the letter, so verb, agent, patient. An example of such a language is Arabic. Then you have the yellow, red, and blue diamonds, and they stand for respectively VPA, PVA, and PAV. And for the sake of completeness, I have added some examples of languages, but I'm not sure any of them will actually be familiar to you. In any case, the numbers show that these diamond, the last 3, these diamond type languages are very infrequent compared to the circle type languages. The Japanese order John the letter read, APV, is the most frequent order, accounting for 48% of the world's languages. The English order John read the letter comes second with 41%. And the Arabic order read John the letter is a distant third with 8%. So theoretically, there are 6 possible orders, but in reality, languages exhibit a clear aversion to 3 of them, namely the 3 last ones. Why is this? Well, at least part of the explanation lies in the order of A and P. Remember that in a sentence like the girl kicked the ball, in a sentence like that, the girl would be the most agent-like entity A, and the ball would be the most patient-like entity P. Now, what the 3 most frequent orders all have in common is that A comes before P. A, P, P, A, P, and V, A, P. In the 3 least frequent orders, A always comes after P. So languages seem to like to have A precede P. In other words, the girl before the ball. And this preference is probably not unrelated to the way that humans see the world and think about the world. More specifically, seeing the world as action, reaction, with action coming first and reaction following it. And in the same vein, the most agent-like entity A is the doer, is where the action starts. The girl hitting the ball with her foot. In our sentence, the girl kicked the ball. And by contrast, the most patient-like entity P is the undergoer of the action, is where we see the reaction of the action. Basically, the ball flying off in our sentence, the girl kicked the ball. So A coming before P in the world's languages seems to reflect this view of the world as action and then reaction. But let's return to English. How does English compare to the world's languages? Well, the AVP, agent, verb, patient word order of English is one of the two most frequent orders in the world. So English definitely belongs on the normal end of the spectrum as far as where word order is concerned. It's perhaps not at the extreme right, though, because the Japanese order of John, the letter red, APV, is still more common. But anyway, our fourth and final example has to do with the words this and that, and the way they are used in sentences like Daniel wanted this book versus Daniel wanted that book. We call such words demonstratives because they help us demonstrate which book we're talking about. They help us point to the book we're talking about. If I say Daniel wanted this book, I'm pointing to a book that's close to me. But if I say Daniel wanted that book, I'm pointing to a book further away from me. We can therefore say that this and that express a two-way contrast in distance, close to the speaker and far away from the speaker. Now, by now, you probably already know that the next thing we're going to do is see how demonstratives, these expressions of pointing, if you want, how they work in other languages. And let's start with French, and more specifically, the equivalent of our English sentence, namely, Daniel voulait ce livre. Now, the demonstrative in this sentence is the word ce in red, voulait meaning wanted and livre meaning book. Now, this word ce expresses that the speaker is pointing to a particular book. But unlike its English counterpart, this and that, this ce does not say whether the book is close to or far from the speaker. It is, in other words, just a pointer, and there is no contrast in distance. Now, people familiar with French might object and say that you can express distance, and that's true, by adding here and there, and literally saying something like ce livre here and ce livre there. The thing is that ce can occur on its own, and is in that sense probably the more basic demonstrative in French. Okay, what about the Northeast Caucasian language of Hunzib? Well, this language has three demonstratives, and they express a three-way contrast in distance. Bud is used to point to something close to the speaker. Bul is used for something not close to or far from the speaker. And ug, finally, is used for something far from the speaker. Now, how do these demonstrative patterns, how are they distributed in the world's languages? Well, let's have another look at the World Atlas of Language Structures. So here we are, and let's now get to the overview of the different chapters. So by clicking on chapters, and then we can again use the search function, Control F, and we can type in demonstratives here, and then we can see what that gives us. And here we have the chapter called Distance Contrasts in Demonstratives. So we can click on that, and that gives us the discussion of this particular grammatical feature. But we can go straight to the map again. So by clicking on that, we see this thing here. And we can focus here on the numbers. And what we see here is that no distance contrast, that we only have 7 languages there. So in other words, the French pattern of not expressing a contrast is clearly very infrequent if you compare it to all of the other numbers. The Hunzib pattern that is with 3 distinctions, so that is the orange circle here, is actually quite frequent here, 88 languages. There are even languages that make more distinctions than 3, as you can see here, but it is evident that the yellow circle, that the English pattern with a 2-way contrast is by far the most frequent pattern, making up more than half of languages here. So as far as this versus that is concerned, English is very much on the normal end of the spectrum. And that brings us to the end of this battle of the grammars. Now, there is no winner, but frankly, that was never really the point. I mainly hope to have shown that when compared to the languages of the world, English grammar is weird in perhaps expected but also unexpected ways, and at the same time that it is also normal in expected and perhaps unexpected ways. And if we really wanted to determine the overall degree of weirdness or normality of English, we would, of course, have to look at many more phenomena. Now, if you find all of this interesting, you could perhaps give that a go. And in fact, I would encourage everyone to explore the World Atlas of Language Structures themselves to see, for instance, if English is weird or normal when it comes to changing the order of words to turn a statement like Daniel should shut up into a yes, no, or polar question like should Daniel shut up, or whether English is weird or normal when it comes to not distinguishing polite you from familiar you, or whether it is weird or normal when it comes to the ability of possessors or genitives to precede as well as follow their possessions in the governor's house, in the house of the governor. Thank you for all for listening.